Hello, good morning, everybody. We have folks from all over the U.S. Today, I do believe. Lots of interest in this topic, and we welcome those of you who are not from Indiana, but I give a special welcome to those of you who are from Indiana. Um, Welcome to the Tackling Racism in Classic Children's Literature webinar. My name is Beth Yates. I am the Children's Consultant at the Indiana State Library in our Professional Development Office, and I will be the host and the question moderator for today. And I am excited to say that our presenters this morning are the fabulous Klem-Marí Cajigas and Lindsey Patrick-Wright, both of the Nashville Public Library. Before we get started, though, I do have a few housekeeping items to share. The first thing is just a reminder that this webinar is a little longer than our usual webinars. It's scheduled to be 91 minutes, and it's worth 2 library education units, aka LEUs, for Indiana library staff. Be sure to stay until the end because your certificate will be available for download at the end of the webinar. If you're having sound issues during the webinar, please see the sound issues box. It's in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen underneath the chat. If there's a global sound issue, meaning that everyone is experiencing it, then we will announce that in the chat box. But if it's just you who's having an issue and we're unable to resolve the sound issue you're experiencing, please be reassured that we are recording the webinar and you can watch it offline at a later date. If you have a question during the webinar, just type it in the chat box in the upper left-hand side of the screen, and I'll be watching it, as will our presenters. And as soon as there's a good opportunity, we will fit that question in, either during the presentation or at the end. We should have, my presenters, if you cannot move the pods, that would be great. Thank you. Anyway, we'll get the questions to the presenters as soon as there's a good opportunity, or there will be time at the end for questions also. So, as I mentioned, today's webinar will be recorded, and after the webinar has been transcribed, it will be available on the Indiana State Library's archived webinars page. And I will send out the recording link to everyone who registered. So if you're participating today, I'll send the link out to you as well. It could be a week or so before it's ready, so if you don't get it immediately after this webinar, please don't worry. You will get it sooner rather than later. No problem, Klem-Marí. No problem. Okay, so we are going to get started, and I'm going to pull up the presentation for the presenters, and we'll make sure that loads properly. There it is. You guys see it too? Klem-Marí and Lindsey, you good?
Yes, I see it. This is Lindsey.
Okay, I'm gonna unmute Klem-Marí. And all right, let's get started. I'm happy to now turn the presentation over to Klem-Marí Cajigas and Lindsey Patrick-Wright. Klem-Marí and Lindsey, take it away.
Thanks, Beth. Thank you so much for inviting us. Klem-Marí and I will introduce ourselves a little bit more in depth in a bit. We're gonna make you work for that. But since you don't have video, I did want to kind of identify who is speaking. I think our voices are different enough that you will be able to figure out quickly which one of us is speaking. But I am Lindsey, and I am in the top right corner. I am the blonde with the very large forehead. So Clem, why don't you just speak for a minute so people can hear your voice?
Hi, I'm Klem-Marí, and if you look at the picture in the corner, I am the brunette wearing the black top and the hoop earrings. So, hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you so much. The reason I start out at the very beginning identifying who I am is because if it isn't obvious from the picture, I am a white woman, and I am co-leading a presentation talking about racism. So I usually love to present, and I was a theater major, and I love getting up in front of people and having all of the attention in the world. And this is, I think, the 6th or 7th time that I've done this presentation, and it never gets easier because, again, I'm a white woman talking about racism. So I've been very honest with you. I would like you all to be honest with us. And we're going to start out. You can use the chat box and tell us how you feel about the topic of racist classic children's books. Do you think it's overblown? Do you think A, it's overblown, they're a product of the past? Do you think B, they're a problem, it needs to be addressed? Or C, you know, I don't know. That's why I'm here. Lots of B's. Okay, so Clem, I guess we can just leave because we don't need to have the presentation.
Apparently, no. Well, there's an A. Ooh.
All right, thank you.
There's some C's. There's some C's. I don't know what. I don't know. That's why I'm here. All right.
All right. So yeah, y'all keep sharing. Again, it kind of gives us an idea of you know, where you are. And this is a very complicated topic, and I think it's why there's so many people in here right now and so many people were interested in it. All right, so we're going to dive in. When I first started doing this presentation, I was doing it alone. Klem-Marí was not with me. She was with me throughout the project that we'll go into detail about, but it was just me, and it was, you know, the first time I did the presentation was for the Tennessee State Library, or the Tennessee Library Association conference, and then I did it for a couple of local libraries as well. And this presentation was largely created to speak to white women because demographically speaking, that is the largest population of people in public libraries is white women. And so when I use the word we, remember that I'm coming from the perspective of a white woman, a Southern white woman. And I do try to be inclusive when I'm trying to speak broader about the profession. But what I was seeing a lot, especially in the midst of this project that we'll talk about, was, you know, primarily the people that were defending the books that we're going to talk about were white women. And so that's, again, largely why I created this presentation and then invited Klem-Marí to join me as the more and more people asked for information about the project. So understanding that, we're actually going to start first by and you know what? I'm going to start right now also by saying that this presentation will contain racist images. It'll contain racist language, and it will also contain some self-divulged white fragility. So especially for the people that are participants who are Black, African American, people of color, or Indigenous people, I do just want to go ahead and let you know that that's happening. So the first thing that we are going to talk about is the book Asterix and the Chariot Race. So Asterix has been around since I was a kid, and we're going to look at just the first 4 pages of this book, and we're going to look specifically about the women. So let's look at this woman, and you know, very Zastig-looking wife, talking about an orgy with her husband. We've got this kind of soothsayer / hag, fortune teller. Up in the top right corner, we have the laundry lady. In the bottom left corner, we've got the milkmaid. And then my personal favorite is this kind of medieval chariot, like equivalent of a car model. All right, so these are the only depictions of women in the first 4 pages of Asterix and the Chariot Race. So those of you who identify as women, let me know in the chat what you think about this. What's going on? Big oof.
Big. Ugh. Yep.
Yeah. Let me know, you know, what are the issues that we have? What's wrong with this? Looks like it says multiple attendees are typing. Okay.
Typing, yes.
I don't want to break Adobe Connect Pro. Misogynistic, absolutely. Yes. I imagine these are going to keep popping up. So what we have here is we have over-sexualization. We have stereotypical gender roles.
Ooh, I'm thinking I should get around to reading my own kids' Asterix books.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're all the same color. They're all depicted from the stereotypical male point of view, POV.
All right. Okay. So again, those of you who identify as women, do you think that these are sexist? We've already seen misogynistic. Do you think they're sexist? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, 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 yes. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yep, yes. They're all white. Yes. Okay. Now, if we were in person, what I would do is I would find, one of the lone white males in the audience, because there aren't that many men, period, but white men. And I would have them read the following. So I want you to visualize that standing before you is a white male, doctorate of women's studies, teaches at Vanderbilt University, women and gender studies, okay? And he says to you women who have identified this as sexist, this was written a long time ago. This is a very popular book. The author did not mean to be sexist. Well, the author is actually known for portraying women positively in his later work. I have a daughter. The men are not portrayed positively either. I don't think this is sexist. Has that professional man changed your mind? Do you still think that this is sexist?
Nope.
I'm sorry, I asked two questions here, but I'm assuming what you all are saying is you still think it is sexist and he has not changed your mind. So again, that was a poor way of me phrasing the question.
He is a jerk, quote.
He is a jerk. Okay, so keep that in mind, all right? That man has not changed your mind, despite delving deeply into the world of women and gender studies, because he walks through life as a man, and he does not know what it feels like to be overly sexualized or to be dismissed. He doesn't know what that feels like. And so he cannot be an expert in what is not sexism. All right. So now I want you all to remember this picture. It was the very first picture that we saw. How many of you noticed these two men in the background? Okay, yes. Good. Some of you noticed it. Some of you may not have noticed it because the white lady that was talking was drawing your attention to the woman and the way she was depicted. So let's talk about the issues that are happening here. What's wrong with these illustrations?
Mm-hmm.
Stereotype.
Number one, they're servants.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to let you all keep talking about this.
They are servants, the only ones of color, the only people of color. The black man is portrayed as a monkey. Okay, yes.
And we'll talk about that.
Features.
Yep. Characters. All right. So yes, you got it. These images are racist. Now, I want you to imagine that a black person, African American person, a person of color, an indigenous person, goes up to a white children's librarian, an expert in their field, and says these are racist. And what they hear is, this was written a long time ago. This is a very popular book. The author did not mean to be racist. The author is actually known for portraying people of color positively in his later work. The all-important I Have a Black Friend. The white characters are not portrayed positively either, and I don't think that this is racist. Do you think that we have changed the mind of that person of color, that black person, that African American person? Absolutely not.
No.
Well, the message,
no way.
The very clear message that we have sent to them is that we don't understand and we are not listening. It's not about the white librarian. Absolutely. So,
yes.
Moving forward in this presentation, Klem-Marí and I are going to use the word racist, racism a lot. And And it's because we have to. We have to in our profession. We as white people have to get used to calling out racism when we see it. So after having spent a lot of time working on this particular subject, something that I'm beginning to understand is that I cannot determine when something is not racist, but if I make an effort, I can begin to identify racism when I see it. Now, I'll never, of course, understand racism from the point of view of a person of color or from the point of view of a Black person or an Indigenous person, but I can begin to see the world through my lens, but understand that my lens is very limited, and I can start to recognize racism. And it's going to smart when you hear, especially when there's going to be some books that we talk about that you probably never considered were racist. And you are going to feel like what we are saying is you are racist. Now, what Ibram X. Kendi says is there is no not racist. There is racist and there is anti-racist. And so yes. Please understand that part of moving towards anti-racism is the acknowledgement of systemic racism. That's you, Klem-Marí.
All right, so yes, systemic racism. Now, a lot of times when we speak about racism, we're talking about specific racist, prejudicial acts of malice, or people who do those things. People who think that white people, for example, Anglos, who think they're superior to Black people, to Hispanics, to Latinos, to Asians, Indigenous persons, what have you. We think that they're limited to individual acts of malice. Those, in actuality, we're talking about systemic racism. The system, the society, the sort of the ether in which everything around us, the public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms and practices and customs work together to reinforce and to perpetuate, to keep on continuing racial group inequity. It's the ways usually systemic racism privileges whiteness or whatever is associated with whiteness, whether it's physical traits, cultural practices, and disadvantages anything that is not white. Anything that is, particularly in the case of the U.S., anything that is associated with Blackness, with Black persons is denigrated. So we're talking about the entire system. The culture in which we live is set up to privilege whiteness and to denigrate Blackness and anything associated with it. So here we have some books that both Lindsey and I have read that have been really helpful and educative toward us.
And so I don't think that we have identified, Klem-Marí, would you like to identify, or would you like to divulge how you identify?
Yes, I am Puerto Rican. I was born on the island. I was raised there on the island until the age of 7, where I then grew up in Orlando, Florida, in the midst of a large Puerto Rican diasporic, meaning, another group of folks dispersed from their quote unquote home country. So I am Puerto Rican. I am Latina. If you want a larger descriptor, but that is how. But I also recognize the fact that I am a very light-skinned, white-skinned Puerto Rican, and that right there has, I believe, in some respects, insulated me from sort of the more extreme effects of systemic racism. Depending on who's looking at me, I can pass. Or people will ask me, "Are you from New Jersey?" And like, no, I'm not from New Jersey. So, so that is how I identify.
And I wanted to again point that out because that is how Klem-Marí and I walk through life. So I've already divulged, I am not an expert in racism. I can never be an expert in racism. But the books that we feature here help me understand racism more and help me, move more toward being anti-racist. I will say that we do have a couple of books on here that are written by white people, and we will talk more about making sure that as a profession we are amplifying the voices of Black people and people of color. However, white people have to talk about this, and we have to get more comfortable talking about this, and sometimes that has to come from other white people. And so specifically the books Waking Up White and White Fragility, those, I haven't read Dying of Whiteness. I think Klem-Marí added that.
Yes.
But, that, what I like to say is if you've got someone that has a long way to go in their anti-racist journey, you might need to start with those. But again, we did want to make sure that we were amplifying voices of people of color as well. All right, so we've I've said I'm not an expert on racism. Klem-Marí, we've talked a little bit about why we're here. Let's talk a little bit more about why we're here.
Okay, so we both work at Nashville Public Library, but in different departments. I am a part of Bringing Books to Life, BBTL. BBTL is an award-winning early literacy outreach program. We go out now virtually to schools and daycares all over the county in which we're located, Davidson County, to do teacher training, story times and we send out our puppet truck shows. And we do specifically, I as the family literacy coordinator, I do family literacy workshops in which I work with parents to just share with them some ways that they can use books more often in their daily life. So, and that's the front page from our brochure.
And I used to be the manager of the children's department of the Nashville Public Library. That is what our library looks like after renovation. We put a playground in the middle of our library. And so the main Nashville Public Library has, I would say probably the largest collection of children's material in the state of Tennessee, maybe even in the Southeast. And, just a really hub of the city, certainly pre-COVID, but anyway. So as the manager of the children's department, what I started noticing around, let's say November of 2016, I'll let y'all use your imagination as to why exactly this started happening around that time. But what we started noticing as the children's staff is that more people were bringing books to our attention that they found problematic. Those are the words that they used. What we use now is racist. And some were white people, some were Black people, so it was just a lot of people kind of, again, viewing these things that we held dear through a different lens. And we just, again, noticed it more and more. At the same time, we had this amazing program at Nashville Public Library called the Civil Rights in a Civil Society, led by our Special Collections Department. And what they did is they took the very rich history of the role that Nashville played in the civil rights movement, and they juxtaposed it with what is happening now, and kind of forced participants to see how far have we come. And, the answer is not very far, obviously, and that we still have a very, very long way to go. Now, remember, when this presentation was created and when this project was going on, the world looked different than it does right now, and what we're going through right now. So the image that you see is Andrea Blackman, who is the head of our Special Collections Department, leading the Civil Rights in the Civil Society for a group of our police cadet recruits. And so they had to go through this as part of their training. And so she was doing this for outside groups and for law enforcement officers. And she finally offered it to staff. And my staff attended, my children, myself and my children's staff attended this. And, you know, my big personal takeaway was, if not us, then who? If not now, then when? You know, I had always felt that I was not racist. Again, anti-racist wasn't part of a larger vocabulary at that point, especially for white people. But I always felt like I was not racist. But I also didn't think that racism was necessarily my problem, which I know now is an incredibly privileged viewpoint to have. And then one day, a Black mom brought goggles to our attention. And they brought it up and she said, "This is racist." Now, if you're a children's librarian, if you're a white children's librarian, I mean, what do we know about Ezra Jack Keats? Like, what are we taught in grad school, or what are we taught from a very early point in our careers? That Ezra Jack Keats was the first children's author to positively portray Black children in his work. And so if I'm standing there and I have a Black mom handing me an Ezra Jack Keats book saying this is racist, I'm like, oh shit, of course I still don't understand. Now we'll talk a little bit about goggles as we move forward. At the same time, I read the book was The Cat in the Hat by Philip Nell. Sorry, it's a bad picture, but the subtitle is called The Hidden Racism of Children's Literature and the Need for Diverse Books. I feel like hidden should be in quotes because it isn't hidden to Black people and people of color, it's hidden to white people. And so, you know, this book did explore Dr. Seuss and The Cat in the Hat, and also, spoiler alert, yes, The Cat in the Hat is a racist stereotype of a minstrel. But it also explored a lot of other classic children's books, all that were on our shelves and all that were circulating wildly. And so I had to ask myself, if not us, then who? If not now, then when? Here I have been trained by a colleague to identify racism, and I've been trained that this is my responsibility, just as a human being. I am responsible for the largest collection of children's material in the state of Tennessee, in the Southeast. What are we going to do about this? But I've also been taught that this certainly should not be my decision to make. So I knew that my perspective isn't the one that counts, and I needed to get together a group of very smart, passionate people. So what I did is I went to our library director, Kent Oliver, who is known for his work with intellectual freedom. Now, I want you to know at the time, and many of you may feel this way. If you feel like sharing it, great. At the time, I wanted them gone. I wanted all of them gone. Any book that could objectively be seen as racist, I wanted them off of our shelves. Let's, put them somewhere else in our collection. And the reason I thought that is because of this book, The Story of Little Black Sambo, which is also another book that's often held up in our profession as, this is wrong, this is racist, we don't do this. And the only place that you can find Little Black Sambo, this version of Little Black Sambo and the other books in the series, are usually in a historical collection because we want them around to say, like, hey, we don't do this. So I took this book to Kent, and I also took another book. Who can tell me what the image on the right is from? What series of books the image on the right is from? Tintin. Yes, Kristen. This is from one of the Adventures of Tintin, and we had 50 plus copies circulating in the state of Tennessee at the time that I had this conversation with Kent. So if the image on the left is absolutely racist and something we don't do and we don't have on our shelves circulating anymore, out of principle, why do we have Tintin circulating? Mm-hmm. And so Kent was like, well, what do you want to do? And I was like, I want them gone. But I also know I am one person, I am a white woman, like, this shouldn't be my call. I want to get together a group of people. I want to take what I learned in civil rights, civil society, and I want to get together a group of diverse people, and I want to talk about this. And so that was what I pitched, was the conversation. And one of those people that I wanted at the table was Klem-Marí.
All right. So what we did was that we gathered up a group of library staffers from different departments, from children's, from collections, from security. And we gathered for a series of conversations over several weeks. It was a diverse group, like I mentioned, from different departments throughout the library, but also different racial and ethnic backgrounds, different ages, sexual orientation. So it was a good crowd. It was one of the really most diverse groups I've ever been in since I've been part of the library. There was required reading because what were we going to talk about? What were we going to talk about? So there was required reading before the meetings. There was also food because there's a quote running around that if you have a meeting without food, it's a hostage situation, something like that. But also, if we're going to have a heavy conversation, let's get some food. Let's get some food in us. We discussed the required reading. We examined the children's books in particular in question and looked at their images and their language. Okay, what about these books makes them racist? And we, from there, identified ideas about how to address these things and the challenges in addressing the fact that these racist books exist in our collection. Lindsey mentioned, well, we want these books gone. But, she wanted these books gone. But, what about intellectual freedom? So these were all the library tradition of intellectual freedom. So these were all things that we discussed that came out of this group. I am in that black and white dress in the bottom picture right there.
So we had someone ask what was the required reading. We do have a list at the end of the books that we recommend. At the time, what we had is we had a couple of articles, because obviously I wasn't going to make everyone read Was the Cat in the Hat Black. Even though it's a great book, it's pretty academic. But we did have an article from the author, and then we had basically like an opposing viewpoint of what the author, was saying. And of course, it was written by a young white woman saying, like, yeah, we know Dr. Seuss did bad, but he did good too. And so we had a couple of those just to get people in the mood for really having this debate. And the other required reading was the books that we are about to examine.
All right. So this is a Dr. Seuss book. You probably recognize it immediately. I believe it is If I Ran the Zoo. And I'll read you a little bit from the fine print. It's a little hard to read, but I'll go to the African island of Yurka and bring back a tizzle-tufted mazurka. Okay, so first of all, there is no African island named Yurka. Yes, it's an imaginative book, but once again, the language we use to talk about different places does form certain images on our mind. I think it's also, also the idea of Africa being one amorphous place. It's not a country, it's a continent full of different countries with cultures and languages in it. And if you look at the drawing of this is supposed to be a person, but the features are exaggerated, the nose, the mouth, the ears. It very much looks like a monkey, and it ties into that very long tradition of likening Black people of African descent, to monkeys. So that ties right in with the racist imagery we're talking about. This is a racist image.
And we will talk later about one of the parts of this project. I don't want to, give it away, but when one of our colleagues, who's a Black woman, shared this book with her biracial child. And we'll talk about what the child had to say about this book. All right, we also have another Dr. Seuss here. This is from To Think I Saw It on Mulberry Street, the image on the left. We have a Chinese man who eats with sticks. Now, this in and of itself is still racist because it's a stereotype. A stereotype is, again, mostly white people are still having a hard time saying racist, and so we use kind of dulled down words such as stereotypes or problematic or racial even. But this is a racist image. We've got the stereotypical way that this person is illustrated. But what's really interesting about this is an edited version of this book. In the original version, the man's skin tone was the same color of yellow as the instrument, trombone. I've just blanked on the word trombone, so that's what happened there. I almost said tuba. Anyway, so his skin color was the same color as the trombone, and he was a Chinaman who eats with sticks. And so the publisher reissued it with these corrections, but they still didn't get it right. Now, the image on the right is the 5 Chinese brothers. When I took this, a couple of these books, when I was showing Kent, he was like, that was my favorite book as a child. And another book that we're going to talk about is Tiki Tiki Timbo. That is a book that had been on my shelf until this project, and I read it to my child, and I can still say the whole name of Tiki Tiki Timbo. So what are the issues with the 5 Chinese brothers? Can you think about that? Can you all talk in chat? What you can talk about, those of you who are familiar with the story, yes, they're stereotypes. Those of you who are familiar with the story, what are the names of the brothers?
They all look the same.
They all look the same, and they are not identified as being quintuplets.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone remember what the name of the brothers are? Got a couple of people typing.
Do they all end in ing?
No, that does kind of draw back to Tiki Tiki Timbo. They are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That is the name of the brothers. So they are dehumanized in that way. All right, Goggles. Does anyone know what might be the issue with Goggles? Why is the Goggles considered racist? Why is the book Goggles considered racist?
We have some typing.
We've got some typing. I mean, if you're all just sitting there saying, I don't know, I mean, that's where I was. We'll see what Michelle has to say. Poor, living in the projects. Yes. And yes. As a matter of fact, Michelle, the word projects is racist as well. Mm-hmm. Saying projects or saying ghetto. Those are both racist terminology. Playing in trash. Absolutely. That is why this is racist. Now, as a white kid, did I play in trash? Absolutely. Trash was treasure. Do lots of white kids play in trash? Absolutely. However, as a white kid growing up in Arkansas in the 80s, I could walk into any school library or any public library and find lots of books on the shelf featuring kids that look like me that weren't playing in the trash. And that is not the case of Goggles when it was published. It's also not the case now. We still have an underrepresentation of Black kids and other children of color and children with other disabilities. Ooh, that's a good question. So if one character was white and the other African American, would it still be racist? I mean, I think yes. I think the answer is yes. Because again, we're still, remember that we are defining racism as a set of structures and as the society that we're living in. And the society that we are living in, we still are seeing an underrepresentation of Black kids.
An underrepresentation and a misrepresentation of, I would say, of Black children. The representations are limited and limiting. So that's what I would say. Yeah.
Again, that being said, that's coming from my perspective as a white woman,
Yeah.
and that's coming from Klem-Marí's perspective as a Puerto Rican woman. So yeah, but lots of kids like trash and get bullied later in the book. Yes, you were saying all the right things. Again,
Yes.
please remember that when this book was handed to me, it was handed to me by a Black mom, by a mom who identified as Black and had Black children. So remember that. She does not want me to say, well, there are a lot of other kids playing in trash and they get bullied later, or white kids play in trash too. So, yes, all of those things are true, but that's not what the mom wanted to hear in the moment. And we'll talk a little bit later about what happens when a similar situation may happen to you, and some tips and tricks that we have developed. We're coming for Clifford.
Yes, we're coming for Clifford and the Berenstain Bears, Berenstein, however you want to pronounce it. So here's an image of Clifford, the big red dog. He is dressed up as a quote-unquote Indian. Now, what's wrong with this image? Why is it racist? Let's see what's coming up in the chat.
People might still be typing about goggles.
Yes,
I think we have a bit of a lag in chat, so I'm going to keep the headdress. Oh, we've got some. We have something by Miss Bridwell, no less.
Yes. So headdress and pipe. Native headdresses are sacred objects. They are not costumes. So here Clifford is wearing it as a costume. He's playing pretend. He's pretending, quote unquote, to be an Indian person, but this is a sacred object and a pipe with which he's playing. And it's just a generic headdress. And there are many native First Nation, there are many indigenous sovereign nations. So this is just a generic representation of what a quote unquote an Indian is. And on the other side, once again, we see the same thing going on in the Berenstain Bears outfit. Once again, the headdress, the sort of like geometric Indian shapes. When you're talking about native folks, native indigenous folks, like, well, okay, what sovereign nation are you talking about? Each nation has their own style of dress and regalia, and these are sacred objects, and they're being used to pretend to dress up. This is why, for example, like, sometimes you'll hear the saying, my culture is not a costume, because particularly, Halloween and things like that, people are like, I'm going to dress up as an Indian and put on some, put what, quote unquote, some Indian outfit. And it's just a mishmash of what are cultural representations of what Indians are. So there was a hand raised.
I think it's down now. Hopefully they're using chat. The comfortable way that many white people, what they would say is going on here is cultural appropriation. Mm-hmm. But again, cultural appropriation happens because of racism. So cultural appropriation is racist. And yes, we have to get used to using the word racist.
Yes. Yeah, and particularly cultural appropriation is racist because for some, when white folks do this, it is a costume. It's fun. It's cute. It's a girl at a it's a lovely white girl at a festival wearing a headdress, and it's cool and it's funky. Whereas a lot, these there were laws and genocidal actions put in place to not allow the indigenous nations to wear their own regalia, to use their own objects, and then they were stolen and put in museums. That's the thing. For some people, it's cool, it's fun. For other folks, they get their culture stolen and they get killed for it.
Speaking of, we've got the Indian covered.
The Indian fun fact, I loved this book as a child. Loved it. I don't know how many times I read it. If you remember, and I recently reread it for the purposes of when we were doing this project, what do you all remember about this book?
I mean, I at first remembered that a toy came to life.
A toy came to life, which is, what child doesn't love the idea of a toy coming to life? But the toy in this question in this book is an actual native person, human being. And when I reread the book as an adult for this project, there was a lot of talk about, this is my Indian. This is like, and this is my Indian. And it was sort of the idea of owning something, of having control over someone, over playing with somebody's life. There's a very particular thing in which the gentleman who the toy it actually is, after he's in the cupboard, identifies himself as Iroquois. And one of the things that the protagonist Omri does to bring another little toy to life, he brings to life, makes real, a teepee. And the Iroquois tells him, "I'm Iroquois. I don't live in a teepee. I live in a longhouse." And he makes like this tiny little longhouse. But even then, it's sort of the idea of the interchangeability of native customs, of native housing, of native aspects. For example, every year, and we'll talk more about this later when we discuss another part of the project, but around Thanksgiving, I'll sometimes visit schools and I'll see some of the lessons and things that are going on, and children have constructed teepees. Teepees are more associated with Plains Indians. Iroquois lived in the Northeast. So once again, the interchangeability, it's all the same thing. And I loved this book as a child. Yeah, go ahead.
So let's talk about Little House on the Prairie, because that seems to be just the elephant in the room when talking about this. So this is specifically from Little House on the Prairie. It's a conversation between Laura and Paul, where Laura's trying to understand the idea of Indian territory and what they're actually doing. So, Laura says, "Will the government make these Indians go west?" "Yes," said Paul. "When white settlers come into country, the Indians have to move on. The government's going to move these Indians farther west any time now. That's why we're here, Laura. White people are going to settle all this country, and we get the best land because we get here first and take our pick. Now do you understand?" "Yes, Paul," Laura said. "But Paul, I thought this was Indian territory. Won't it make the Indians mad to have to—" "No more questions, Laura. Go to sleep." So most of the justifications or the arguments that I see primarily on social media about the value of Little House on the Prairie is this idea that Laura questions her dad about what they're doing, and that the book was written, it's semi-autobiographical. She was just writing about the time. She was just writing about her experience. Absolutely all true. And it's still racist.
Yeah.
So here's another one. This presentation was initially called "Ma Said What?" Because Ma is often credited as saying the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Now, Ma has very racist ideas about Indians. However, I don't think that she ever says in the series the only good Indian is a dead Indian. I think that their neighbors, the Scots, say it, and here's an example of it. On the right, we have an illustration of a particularly tense scene in which and I'm going to use the term Indians because that's how it's used in the book, in which the Indians come into the house and steal Paul's tobacco and steal the pellets. And it's a very, very tense scene in which, everyone is just absolutely terrified. Now, again, I see quite a bit of people talking, and I know, this is a very hot button idea, a hot button issue about Little House on the Prairie. And it is primarily because so many people have fond memories of the series. and reading it as a child and wanting to share this with their children. It's where they learn, and the TV show, it's where they learn that, like, at the end of a long day, you can ask your mom for sugar water and maybe she'll give it to you because you read about it in Little House on the Prairie. However, we have to acknowledge that this book is racist. If the just a couple of examples that I've given you here don't convince you, maybe this will. This is an illustration of Paul in blackface during a talent show. This is from Little House in the Big Woods, I believe. Now, saying that this is a product of the time doesn't justify this. It's still racist. Now, we'll talk about what quote unquote value books like this have in a minute when we talk about like what the group actually talked about.
Blackface, if I may jump in, blackface
Absolutely.
was racist then when Paul was doing it in the book, when minstrel shows were going around the country, and it continues to be racist now because what it does, it caricatures people of African descent, it characters Black people, it makes them, it sort of dehumanizes them, makes them stereotyping them as the minstrel shows as simple, as poor, as uneducated. It was racist when Paul did it. It was racist when it was depicted in Little House of the Prairie, and it continues to be racist today.
So I see that there's some good chat going. Keep it up, please. Specifically, Melissa Freed mentioned Prairie Lotus. I have not read that, and I'll talk a little bit more about why I haven't read it yet, but that has come up in a number of our presentations so far, and it has been, given quite the seal of approval. Now, some of the stuff that y'all are talking about, teaching tool, historical talking point, we're gonna talk about that a little bit further as we go on. But after we examined these books, and there were many more, like I said, Tiki Tiki Tembo was in there, The Secret Garden.
Skippy John Jones.
Skippy John Jones, yeah. So, we examined a ton of books, and I know this slide is annoyingly dense with text, and the point is that obviously at the end of it, it was like, this is an incredibly complicated issue. And we came up with a lot of challenges and also a lot of ideas about how we can counteract these challenges or address these challenges. Am I talking over you, Klem-Marí?
No, you're not. You're fine.
Okay. All right.
Was I doing this part? Was I going to do this part though? I think so.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so let's go ahead. So one of the things as you saw in the previous slide, we identified a lot of challenges. Okay, so we have these racist books in our shelf. Now what? So we put the different challenges we came up with across the room and started putting little sticky notes, just a lot of like hands-on brainstorming of things that we could do to address the context of this inaccurate and racist material. Things like read-alikes. Many of you have mentioned the Prairie Lotus, or somebody just mentioned the Birch Bark House series by Louise Erdrich, who herself is an Indigenous author. Okay, great. So different, read-alikes. If you like this, if you like Little House on the Prairie, consider the Birch Bark House series. It's a more accurate representation of Indigenous peoples. Blog posts, shelf talkers. So we did all this around the room and sort of started basically, okay, let's just think of how we can address it. And we came up with a lot of different ways. So what is not being said, Lindsey, this is you.
No, it's actually you. You start.
Oh, yeah. So what is not being said? I think at this point we're talking about emotional labor. Thank you. So here, one of the things that comes up when we talk about racism is that a lot of times it becomes incumbent upon non-white people, non-Anglo people, Black persons, me being Latina in my occasion. It's we are made to carry the bulk and the heavy emotions associated with all of this. Lindsey mentioned she'll talk about white fragility and that sort of thing. For me, talking about racism is part and parcel of the everyday because it's something that I have experienced. So there's we want to acknowledge that for some folks in the room, in the virtual room, as were myself included, this is a really heavy topic, and looking at these images is really damaging and triggering. And for when black, black persons, people of color, indigenous persons are often asked to, hey, so asked to be the sole representative for their group, or ask these questions. Well, if we do this, is the book still okay? We're being asked to do a whole host of emotional labor for white persons who are trying to shield themselves from having, yes, what is a tough conversation.
Right. And so knowing that I should not be the one that makes any decision in a void, I also knew that I was asking my colleagues that I care about deeply to also bring the additional emotional labor of just having to be a person who's sometimes marginalized in their day-to-day work environment, to expend even more emotional labor. And now is when I'm going to talk about my white fragility and my emotional labor, but for a reason, I promise. Hopefully. This is, like I was saying in the beginning, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. And I've given birth. Like this project was constantly draining, and I cried many tears. Klem-Marí never saw any of those tears, neither did any of my colleagues of color, because that's not helpful. So I found a white colleague to confide in. But what needs to be said is at no point during this project was my life or my livelihood on the line. What was on the line was me being uncomfortable alive and me having hurt feelings. At one point, and we'll talk about this a little bit in a second, at one point I was facilitating this conversation, and I was like, well, when that mom brought me goggles, I wanted to apologize. And one of my colleagues, who is a Black woman, said, what for? What are you apologizing for? And it's like, racism. And she's like, what are you going to do about it? And so, again, we'll talk about what is a better thing to say, but what I was taking on was more than I should take on. And fortunately, I had colleagues in my life that, when I said, one of the challenges we want to address is, do staff know how to have conversations about their own experiences and perspective versus the experience of others? This is a very valuable challenge that needs to be addressed. Even in a system as progressive as I think Nashville Public Library is, with a program like Civil Rights Civil Society, this is still a challenge we need to address and an issue we need to address. Does this group of people that I gather to talk about classic children's books that are racist, do they need to talk about it? No. So fortunately, I had someone that said, hey, Lindsey, you need to stay in your lane. And that was a gift that they gave me. Yes, Christy said white fragility talks about white woman tears. White people do not have what Robin DiAngelo calls white people do not have the stamina to talk about issues of race. And that's why it was exhausting. It's still exhausting, but it doesn't. There's no way it compares to the exhaustion of experiencing racism, and that is a privilege check that you have to constantly give yourself.
It's
So,
one thing to talk about, if I may jump in, to talk about
sure.
racism. It's another whole exhausting thing to experience it and to be made to explain it, and to a lot of times in these conversations, the concept of white women's tears, um, because white people don't have the stamina or haven't built up the stamina by via experience to talk about race. Yeah, there's the going back to my feelings are hurt, and oftentimes black persons, people of color, other folks, non-white folks in the room are made to sort of comfort the hurt white feelings, and there is no comfort or reciprocity or caring for the non-white folks in the room who experience this racism, and who in order to sort of try to make people care about racism, often have to lay themselves bare in an effort to get other people to care and to even see them as persons. So that's that's where my thinking leads me.
Thank you for sharing that. All right, y'all, we're getting to the action plan. What do you think? Do you think we pulled the books? You can say in chat.
We have had people ask us that already. So what did you do with the books?
We got some no's. Maybe some of them. No. All right. All right. This is a peek inside my brain. So I knew that this was a project that could easily get thrown by the wayside should a staffing shortage come along or some other, bigger project. And so I created an action plan. Now, it would have been really easy for me to fix this slide, but I didn't on purpose. What you see up at the top is one of the first challenges we addressed, which is highlight diverse collection and alternatives to culturally insensitive books, and the action steps that we took. But note here that I say solution, as in I solved it. So what is the term for a white person that thinks that they can come in and solve a complicated issue like racism? White savior, absolutely. And I was fortunately given the gift from a fellow colleague that told me to check my white saviorism. And it's, of course, embarrassing to say that now, but I still think that that's something, while I'm out here talking on a national level about racism, that's something that I have to constantly do. So our first challenge was highlighting diverse collections and alternative, like the Birch Bark series. And of course, we created
subcommittees. So the challenge one was to, can we go back a slide?
Yeah.
Real quick, to highlight the diverse collection alternatives to racist classics. Yes, we've mentioned the Birch Bark series. Okay, next slide. So we curated book lists, a diverse group of library staffers. We got together and curated children's books that feature children from a wide variety of backgrounds and experiences and ethnicities. That feature them just being children. A lot of times when books have a non-white protagonist, a lot of times it's a very heavy issue book. It's a downbeat sort of book. It's about, when books feature Black children, a lot of times, sometimes it's said that they feature civil rights or basketball. There's a lot more to that. So there's a lot more to Black children in that. So we curated different lists of books featuring children being children, featuring Black children, African American African children in diaspora, Black experience in the U.S., books about neurologically diverse children, books about Latinx children, LGBTQIA, refugee books featuring refugees. So all of these books are in our. You can link to them. You can follow the links to our library website, books, movies, music, children, and scroll down. You can find all of these lists that different staffers curated as part of this project.
Another part of the project was we created blog posts. So, good. I think Janine points out good librarians have already been selecting diverse books. Absolutely. At the end of the day, this committee decided that we need to do what librarians do best. We need to share resources, which is the diverse books, and highlight them. We need to model social conversations. That's something that MPL does particularly well. And so we created a series of blog posts that are still available on our website, in which each of us re-examined these books from a critical lens. Oh, thank you, Beth.
Yes.
They put our book list page up, so thank you. So one of our colleagues, who's a Black mom, and she had children who were biracial, and one of her children is neurodiverse. She took home And to Think I Saw It on Mulberry Street, and If I Ran the Zoo, and we talked about that. And so when we were examining that one page from If I Ran the Zoo with the pictures of men who looked like monkeys, you know, she asked critical questions to her child, and she said, well, you know, what do you think about the way that person is drawn? And the girl, who I think was about 4 at the time, said, oh, Mommy, that's not a person, that's a monkey. And so, you know, then that mom had to make the decision, like, you know, do I let her think that that's a monkey right now, or do I talk to her about the fact that that's actually supposed to be representative of a person? And you can read the blog post to find out what she said. We had another colleague who is a father, and he's Black, and his tween daughter, he took home Tintin and Asterix, and you know, they were supposed to kind of read this together, and then he turned around and she's in the corner just like plowing through these books. And so he talks about what that is like. Klem-Marí read The Thanksgiving Story, not a Thanksgiving Story, but The Thanksgiving Story, which is an award-winning book that's requested a lot this time, or during Thanksgiving. And she did it from, you know, her perspective of an early childhood specialist and a doting aunt. And then I read Little House on the Prairie to my then 8-year-old white-appearing child, much to her chagrin, because, you know, this just isn't our jam. And so earlier when I was talking about loving Little House, and, you know, that's part of the problem that people are having, like, I didn't read Little House. I don't love it. My kid does not love it, but we were able to have very pointed conversations about the racism that would take place. So I would read The Only Good Indian is a Dead Indian. I'd close the book, and then we would talk about it. And I wrote about that experience in my blog post. Now, you'll notice that there are 4 different blog posts here, and I am the only white perspective. And that is because, again, I want to amplify the voices of my colleagues of color, because we need to be doing that more as a profession. However, white people have got to be having conversations about racism with their children. We have to make sure that, again, the white appearing child that I am raising is able to have the stamina to have conversations about racism and stand up when she identifies it and when she sees it happening. The other challenge is staff need more resources about having sensitive conversations about challenged materials. So again, you know, what good librarians do, we share resources with the community. We model how to have, you know, culturally important conversations with the community, and then we also make sure that our staff have the resources that we need. So this group took something that was already out there from the Cooperative Children's Book Center, and this is available at the end, so I know there's no way that you can read this, but it's basically like, you know, what happens when a circulation assistant is the person that is brought, you know, goggles and said this book is racist. You know, a lot of us, again, we want to apologize. We want to explain, like, we want to try to say we are not a racist organization. So we can absolutely say the wrong thing. And so what we did is we used these talking points, we tweaked them a little bit. And the biggest takeaway is that we listen. You know, we do have a request for reconsideration policy if that's where the if that's where the person wants to take it. But the gift that, again, I say that a lot, but I think we have to reframe any criticism that we get. We, again, being white people, when it comes to the issue of racism and trying to be anti-racist, we need to take any criticism we get as gifts, because people are trusting us to be better. And so when my colleague gave me the gift of, really laying into me when I wanted to apologize about this, I said, well, what do I say? And she said, you say thank you. Mm-hmm. And that has honestly changed the way I serve the community. This has helped me for things dealing with racism. Again, I've been called out many times throughout the length of this project because I have messed up and I will continue to mess up. But instead of trying to justify what I've done, every time someone gives me the gift of calling me out, I say thank you, and I will be better. And so that is what I say now when someone brings something to my attention, whether it's, again, a complaint about a book that has racism or that is racist, or if someone is, they come to me as a manager and they're like, this person, your staff person was rude to me. I start off with like, well, thank you for telling me that. Because again, it's a gift that this person's giving you and trusting you with. So again, these tips and talking points, we link to, but I think we put MPL in there a couple of times. It is mostly from the Children's Book Center. So let's talk about.
Sorry, right. Lindsey, this is Beth. Would you be willing to explain a little bit more about white women not having stamina?
Oh, sure. And this is a concept from White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. The idea is that Black people and people of color and Indigenous people have had to talk to their children and to each other about race and racism forever. And that is something that and so the idea of stamina is that those of us who, especially like someone like me who grew up in the 80s when we were taught the idea of color blindness, and that it's better to not see people's color and treat everyone equally, when we are finally understanding that is counterproductive and offensive and racist, that in fact we do need to talk about race. We have never been given the tools to talk about race. And just saying the word race, or just saying that someone is Black or African American, sometimes we will dance around that. If I'm going to describe Klem-Marí, instead of saying, she's Puerto Rican, which is, something that Klem-Marí is very proud of and loves to be identified as, I might say, well, she's got curly hair. She's a loud and fast talker. She's very smart. She's about this tall. When I may be describing a lot of people in the room, but if I said, well, she's Puerto Rican, they'd be like, okay, I know who you're talking about. But again, we haven't built up this tolerance for being able to talk about race and racism openly. I hope I did a good job of explaining that.
Yes. And no. And sometimes, and I think because white folks haven't built up the stamina, a lot of times it can oftentimes go into defensiveness, white guilt, hurt feelings. And because white folks haven't built up the stamina, the strength, the longevity to have this hard conversation, whereas non-white persons, Black persons, Latino persons, other folks have experienced this and have had conversations with their children from a very young age. They've had these conversations from young ages, so they have a vocabulary and a vocabulary with which to have conversations about race. White folks, because a lot of times, as Lindsey mentioned, being raised with the idea of colorblindness, don't have that vocabulary, and it can often sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, well, that's not what I meant, and now my feelings are hurt. And that's where also the white fragility piece comes in. It's about having stamina in the sense of being able to have the hard conversation about race.
Yeah, and sorry, this is Beth again. I know you have a few more slides to get through before we have a full discussion, but I just wanted to mention for Janine, lumping us all together, I think it's really important to also kind of wrap our brains around the difference between what we maybe have grown up thinking is a racist act, which is like a single act that someone does that is harmful against someone else or a group of people, versus systemic racism. And what they're talking about today is kind of more systemic racism, which is that all white people do benefit from a system that's built by and for them to succeed. That's just the way society is. And kind of looking at that and addressing it and realizing it, and then figuring out how we might be able to make some changes. Does that sound accurate? Am I on mark, Lindsey and Klem-Marí?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think I've been pretty careful throughout this presentation to say some white people. And if some people feel personally attacked when I make comments about some white people or white people, I would just say this is an opportunity for you to tap into your own empathy and understand that this may feel sensitive and it may hurt feelings, but it still doesn't compare to what it feels like, I imagine, to experience racism. So I know we still haven't answered whether we pulled the books. We didn't.
No.
We didn't pull the books. I still want some of them gone. I do. I absolutely still want some of the Tintin gone. I want, I don't want Little House gone necessarily, but we didn't pull the books because, again, we stuck to what libraries do, and libraries don't censor. So those books are still on our shelves. We don't do selective weeding. I've seen that being talked about a lot in social media circles, that people are like, well, it's old, so I removed it and I'm not going to order it again. If it fits within your collection development policy, then great. But if you're doing selective weeding, that's tantamount to censorship. So we're going to talk a little bit about what can't be quantified as we wrap this up. So, Klem-Marí, what was your takeaway from this project?
One of the things that I really took away from this project was that I was not and am not alone within the Nashville Public Library system in my concerns about race, representation, inclusivity, diversity. I am one of two Puerto Ricans on the entire NPL staff. That I've often been the only Puerto Rican person in a room, in a system, what have you. It can be exceedingly lonely, and I blog rather regularly for the library website and a lot of times it feels like I'm the only one. Sometimes it has felt like I'm the only one who's concerned about having diverse books, about representation mattering, about the kinds of books that we recommend to teachers, to parents, as, hey, these are good books to use in your classroom, good books to teach in. And I got to meet, by virtue of this project, other people for whom, both white and non-white, for other people for whom this was important, who were concerned about this. The comedian Hari Kondabolu often talks about asking me to not, I'm paraphrasing here, asking me to not talk about racism is asking me to not talk about water when I'm drowning. Sort of the idea, it's everywhere. How can I not talk about it? So I got to meet other people for whom racism, discussing it, confronting it, is important. And for me, that was an invaluable experience, an invaluable part of this, because a lot of times it has felt like I have been the lone voice in the wilderness, and I'm not the only one.
Thank you for sharing that, Klem-Marí. I have found myself in the past, year or two since this project has wrapped up, and since I, went around and spoke at all of the different public service meetings within our department to talk about tips and talking points, and to talk about the fact that we have these books on our shelves, and we need to acknowledge that we have these books on our shelves, and we need to continue to have conversations that we've been taught to have thanks to my colleague Andrea Blackman and her special collections department. So I've put myself out there, and I'm not going to use the A word, meaning ally, but I have been approached on a couple of different occasions by my colleagues of color who want something addressed, either administratively or they just want some clarification, but they want me to use my white privilege and address the issue. And by putting myself out there, and again, there was nothing fun about it at all. But by putting myself out there, I have identified myself as someone who's at least willing to listen, and is willing to try, and is willing to attempt to be a co-conspirator. And so that to me has meant a lot. That I've had a couple of people who identify me as that. The A word that, I want to be anti-racist. The A word that I didn't want to use is ally. I think ally is, it's problematic in the way people use it. So another thing is that just by going through this process, every team that I've worked for, so again, the children's team that I had, and the team that I currently have, I've switched jobs, and I'm now the manager in the most diverse community, truly diverse community in the city of Nashville and maybe the Southeast. My teams are very comfortable having open, hard conversations about race. And because we are in the profession of public libraries, and we still have a long way to go to achieve equity and diversity in our system, it is primarily white people that make up our staff still. So it's made my team stronger. No one has picked up on it yet. What's the issue with this slide? I see. So y'all saw it. You saw it. You just didn't want to say anything. That's exactly right. When I was putting together this presentation, and I wanted to just find a clip art on teamwork, I looked it in, and these were my top searches. Now Google's smart, and maybe it was using my algorithm, and I am very identifiable as a white woman, and that's why they're very white. These are the first images, just all white hands, more white hands, a lot of white hands. I got excited about this one, but then I realized he's not a person of color. He just has a sleeve tattoo. So what I ask you all to do, the challenge that I'm going to issue to you all, is be uncomfortable. Like Beth just said, there is very little about race. There's nothing about racism that's comfortable, even for the people who are openly racist. Be insulation. What I mean by that is we sometimes have curated some pretty significant echo chambers on social media, and you just have these ideas bouncing off of each other, and there's no actual progress. Something that I have done as a result of this is, instead of being an echo chamber and trying to convince people that we live in a racist society and that we as white people benefit from this racist society on a daily, minute-by-minute basis, when they're not ready to hear that, instead of just saying the same thing over and over again, I will take a minute and I will send an email to a legislator about a racist policy that I would like changed, or I will take $5 and I will donate it to an organization that can use that money. Now, if I'm really being cheeky and it's on social media and I'm trying to really poke my racist Uncle Larry, then I'll take a screenshot of whatever I've done and I'll put that on his racist post. And it, again, like, I get my point across, but I've actually done something that's beneficial and could help someone. consider the source. I saw someone mention that there's been a lot of criticism about white fragility, and good. There should be. There should be criticism about absolutely everything. That's the democratic world, society, I should say, country that we live in.
Little d Democrat, little d Democratic, yes.
Little d, yes. However, consider the source of who is who's criticizing white fragility. If it's something, you know, again, when we first started doing this presentation, we had people that, you know, I was sending out articles saying like, hey, this is a serious issue, we've got to address it. And then I would have other people, white people, sending articles saying like, look, here's another article that says it's not a big deal. And it was written by a white girl for like a college class. And so if you read something that makes you feel warm and fuzzy about this topic, then you need to look at the source and see, you know, who's writing it and what perspectives they're coming from. Read outside your perspective. This is huge. You know, this is what we do. You know, but this is something that you need to do in your own life too. And it's something I've not been very good about until the last couple of years when I've been really intentional. You know, if you love Rick Bragg, read Jacqueline Woodson. If you love, you know, John Grisham and mysteries, we read some, you know, Devil in a Blue Dress. Buy books by diverse authors. We're not going to change the publishing industry until we put our money where our mouth is. And constantly ask yourself who's being left out. Because if you do a little bit of work, you will be able to make sure that the right people are at the table. So we're at questions, and I'm going to actually start with a question that we saw early on, and it was like, well, what do you do if you don't have diversity at your library? What if you want to have this conversation and you don't have diversity at your library? You can still start the conversation. You're going to have, you may not have racial diversity, but you will have diversity of some sort. But something that we were asked, I think the last time we did this presentation is, did you ever ask the public what they wanted to do with the books? We didn't. I wanted to have focus groups, but it just wasn't something that ever came about. And so if you find that you don't have diversity in your staff, maybe you have diversity in your community. Maybe you have diversity in the patrons that come into your library, and you can put together a focus group and talk about this. But remember, yes, at the end of the day, we obviously listen and respond to our community, but our decisions need to be backed up by policy, the decisions that we make when it comes to the collection.
And our task force was made up of people, yes, racial and ethnic diversity, but we also had people from different departments, because a security guard is going to have a different perspective on this than, for example, a collection development, and a person who works with children in children's librarian versus, you know, an adult librarian, someone who works with seniors. So there are ways to sort of think about getting a multiplicity of perspectives when you have these conversations. And as Lindsey mentioned, it's important for white folks to have these conversations about race, to even, yes, be uncomfortable. It's important. Lindsey mentioned it, and Beth mentioned it too. It's important to be it's okay to be uncomfortable. From that discomfort comes growth, and also bear in mind that non-white folks, Black persons, for me being Puerto Rican in the United States, we have these conversations. We're often uncomfortable. I am uncomfortable a lot. So, you know, after Hurricane Maria hit in 2017, I was exceedingly uncomfortable. So, and I sat with it because, well, because the only way out was through. And I think when we're having these conversations about race, the only way out is through, once again, having that stamina to go through it, to be uncomfortable, to have those uncomfortable moments about it.
So Beth, you'll have to we've got some questions, and I've got time to stick around and answer them. But if like we have to get out of the room, cut us off.
Yeah.
And you can, if you don't mind putting up the slide that has our email. We often get, people don't want to put a question out there publicly, but we will get a follow-up question through email. So the first one that I see is,
can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so what I'd like to do, if that's okay with you guys, is we have kind of there's 3 different questions, but they're really all addressing how do you handle, well, specifically, like if there's a book that someone complained about and you don't remove it, what do you do? And then also if you are in need of ordering fresh titles and you're removing a controversial book or a book with some racist portions to it, how do you handle that? So like the collection development sort of stuff. So if you could answer that one pretty quick, then after we do that, I will pull up that last section with the LEU certificate and the other downloadables.
Sure. So this really comes down to being able to actively listen to your community. And the reason why we pulled the tips and talking points that we did from the Center for Children's Books is because it was primarily from people who came up and said, you've got Heather Has Two Mommies on your shelf, or In Tango Makes Three, and I have a really big issue with it. It really isn't, it isn't unlike this. The passion that people feel about their beliefs is just as strong, even if they're coming from very different perspectives. And so what we found is instead of justifying the book, which is not what, it's not going to work, and it's not what the patron wants, they want to be heard. And so in every instance that I've had where a book has been brought to my attention, I've had the luxury and the privilege of being able to say, thank you so much for bringing this book to my attention. Do you want to go over here and let's, I'd love to hear more about this book. And, I do at the end. It's almost like with any complaint as a manager, I'm like, well, what would make you feel better right now? And sometimes, luckily, they're actually just talking about it has made me feel better. I thought in the beginning, what we could do is every time someone comes up, we can say, well, we've got these book lists, or, we've got these blog posts that talk about how you can share this book. A lot of times, especially, again, if it is a person of color that's bringing this to our attention, they don't need to know how to talk to their kids about these books. They just want to be heard.
Yes.
So a lot of times I would just kind of follow the flow of the conversation. And if it felt like this person might like to hear that we have had this year-long conversation about this, and that we do take it very seriously, and that we considered pulling the books, and this is the reason we kept them on the shelf, I will tell them that. But a lot of times they just want to be heard. And so that's the biggest piece of advice I can get. When it comes down to the actual collection development part of this, when the Thanksgiving story copies are worn out, do they get reordered? They do get reordered. Are they reordered at a 1-to-1 ratio? Not necessarily, because they aren't, slowly but surely they aren't getting checked out as prolifically as they have been in the past. A lot of times teachers just go through and they see the Thanksgiving story and they click on it. But I think, our educators are also beginning to understand that they need to look at the idea of the Thanksgiving story more critically. And even, Little House on the Prairie, any classic book needs to be examined much more critically. So, while people were saying before, you can use these as teaching points, absolutely. But you could also just say the Birch Bark series accomplishes everything that Little House on the Prairie did by giving a perspective, but it does it in a way that is not racist and that is more inclusive of our history in this country. I think I answered all of the questions.
Thank you.
There was a question. Can I jump in, Beth? Is that all right?
Sure. Really quick, I
Go
think
ahead.
what we'll do is let me just give a note to those who might be watching this recording in the future. I'm going to share the LEU certificate with the folks who are live here, but if you're watching a recording of this, there are instructions on how you get your LEU certificate in the description on YouTube and on the Indiana State Library's website. And the handouts that I'm going to share here in just a second also, you can download from the Indiana State Library's webinar archive webinar page also. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to that, and then if you guys want to keep answering questions, we can go on doing that for a few more minutes for those who want to stay. If you can't stay, that's okay too. So here we go. I'm going to share this really quick. Up at the top, you'll see the talking points that Lindsey mentioned, and then their reading list handout, and then the Tackling Racism Children's Lit LEU certificate. Those you can click on, and then the download file the button will highlight. And then down at the bottom are Lindsey and Klem-Marí's email addresses, as well as mine if you need anything from me. So that's, I'll stop talking now, and you guys can answer more questions if you want to. Thanks.
There was another question about if we're having staff, if staff are having conversations with people who may be checking out Dr.
Oh,
Seuss.
Yeah. That usually no. Usually it's a no. I've seen that a lot on social media, because that betrays our patron right to privacy. You know, if we have an existing relationship with that customer, if they've made it clear that they, you know, want to have conversations with us about the books they're checking out, if they have asked us before about, you know, ensuring that the books that they share with their child are culturally sensitive, then absolutely we can have a conversation about that. But that's a relationship that needs to exist. You know, if just a stranger, you know, or a person that you don't know well at all comes up and is like, oh, I'm so excited to share Little House on the Prairie with my daughter. I read it and I loved it as a kid. And you don't have a pre-existing relationship with this person, you know, that is not the time to tell them, oh, did you know that this book is racist? So, you know, if she follows, you know, if you see her in again and you're like, how's it been going sharing Little House on the Prairie? You know, you could absolutely say, you know, here's another interesting series, the Prairie Lotus, or here's, it's not a series, here's the Birchbark series, which is written from the perspective of an Indigenous person. That is more appropriate. That's just good reader's advisory. But in the moment when someone's checking out, it's hard not to do that. Especially if you know, are giving good customer service, which is assuming positive intent, you know, but that's not the role that we should play.
Yeah, and I think
documents.
that's, as Lindsey mentioned, that's reader's advisory. And I think also as librarians, there was an earlier question. You know, there's things that we can do to get, you know, other books, other recommendations outside of these, you know, outside of the normal, you know, the Dr. Seuss and stuff into people's hands. You know, there's displays. If you like Little House, consider the Birchbark series and have some copies out on display. The kinds of books that we highlight in our departments, in our children's areas. I know it's different now with COVID, and some libraries are open and some are not to the public. We are not currently open to the public, but there are things that we can do when we have displays. Hey, put this book out so that people can see it and look at it. The kinds of books that we recommend to our patrons. There was a question earlier. I know you mentioned we as librarians aren't truly gatekeepers, but do you feel the stakes are higher when examining our children's collection versus adult materials?
That was my whole issue, is that you know, we're taught in library school, and I was teaching children's literature for University of Tennessee, and I said, when examining a book, you want to examine the harm that it might cause a child. And so when you're looking, you know, when you look at these racist books as potential teaching opportunities, that's great for a child who might be sharing that book with an adult who is sharing it with them in a culturally conscious way. But the idea that kids are just pulling the books off the shelf and reading them, you do feel like, I don't believe that we're gatekeepers. I don't like that word for what we do, but I understand why it exists. But because you do feel responsible for the books that are on your shelf. And so I did not like the idea of, a child of color pulling Tintin off the shelf and seeing that representation of, a Black person, an African person, and thinking that me as the librarian thinks that's okay. I also didn't like the idea of a white child pulling that book off the shelf and seeing that representation and not having an adult in their life say, whoa, 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 let's talk about what's going on in this picture and why it is racist and bad.
Yeah. I know for me, as someone who works with parents, and also because I'm often invited to do these family literacy workshops at the behest of teachers, at the behest of staff, one of the things that and we also, as part of the program that we do with these family literacy workshops, we give books to families, like a paperback book to take home for each workshop. And the sites we do a workshop with get a hardcover book to put in their collection. So I know that I'm not the gatekeeper, but I make it, because I have that privilege right then and there to pick the book that I'm going to give them. So I make sure that it's a book that features a non-white child, written by a non-white author. I make sure that it's a diverse, inclusive book. So I think that we as librarians, in the books we read in story time, if a child is looking, hey, I like books about dinosaurs, we can be intentional and think about, okay, well, I'm going to get them a book that features this, that's written by this person, as opposed to, a lot of times it's, for example, if someone is having a child, let's give them a book, we automatically go for Dr. Seuss. Someone graduates from school, let's give them The Places You'll Go. We can do the harder work, as Lindsey demonstrated with the TeamWorks clip art, to think of other books that we can give to people, that we can recommend to people, that we can put on display, that we can write about in our blogs.
As people are saying, thank you to us, I do want to extend a thank you to everyone who came.
Yes.
We asked you in the beginning to identify where you kind of fell in this, and those of you who feel like who felt like this idea was overblown, or and you still feel that way. Thank you for participating, for actively participating in this conversation. It's something that it's a necessary conversation that we as a profession have to keep having, and especially in a profession that is, again, predominantly white. We need to keep having this conversation, even though, as you all see, there are no easy answers to this.
Thank you, Lindsey and Klem-Marí. I agree. There is no easy answer. So I hope that anybody who came for the easy answers is not too disappointed. But it's definitely, it's conversations that we have to have, and each library needs to figure it out. But I really appreciate you bringing this awareness and information to library staff in our state and really across the nation, because we have quite a few people from outside of Indiana here too. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think now, unless we have any additional questions, which I don't see, I think it's mostly thank yous. I'm going to go ahead and we presenters will mute ourselves, and I'll leave the window open for another minute or two in case anyone's still working on downloading those things or writing email addresses down. And then in a couple minutes, we will close the room. So thanks again, everybody, for attending, and thank you again to Klem-Marí and Lindsey, and everybody have a nice afternoon. Bye.
Thanks for having us, Beth. Bye-bye.
Bye.